Okay, picking up where I left off before. So we have these four different categories of the way the state was involved in economic growth in most of these countries. What we see happening, however, in the late 1980s and late 1990s is a significant transition or transformation towards what's called neoliberalism. What basically neoliberalism essentially means is a more market-based economy, where the role of the state is de-emphasized, where the state or the government will be doing less and less in the promotion of economic growth. And this basically happened in the third world or in the developing world, primarily because of pressure from external forces, especially the International Monetary Fund, as well as the World Bank, that put pressure on these governments to move towards market economies and away from state-led economic development. So we see this uniformization, essentially, of most of the countries around the world, with some exceptions. Cuba still remains very much a command economy. And even though Cuba is also loosening things up, China has loosened up considerably since the 1980s. Even though it still has some aspects of a command economy, there's a lot of aspects of market-based economies that we see happening in China as well. So we see this vast transformation towards essentially a common way of the role of the state in the economies, which is the market-based economies. One of the things that we have found before and after this transition to neoliberalism is that the state has been asked to, or there's pressure put on the states to perform other economic roles. And one of the most important ones has to do with the state playing a role in the promotion of economic quality, in trying to make sure that the gap between the rich and the poor are not too sizable. In other words, that things are much more geared towards the promotion of a large middle class. And I've asked you to watch a couple of videos that are related to income inequality in the United States over time, as well as income inequality globally not over time, but around the globe. But I want to show you is a couple of graphs indicating over time across a variety of countries what we're talking about here in terms of inequality. So the graph that you see in front of you indicates the percentage share of annual income of the entire country that the top 100% possess. Okay. So, and then this is for a variety of countries: France, Sweden, U.S., Japan, and United Kingdom. And so what we see is that, in the early part of the 20th century, most of the countries are pretty close together, and the top 1% have a fairly sizable share of the national income, of all the income that's generated in a country. Sometimes even coming in around 20% of what the country makes. And we see this, moving towards less inequality, certainly, more greater income equality over time until this period in the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, where again these countries are all around the same place, all these industrial democracies, just in between 5 and 10% of the national income is actually owned by just the 1% of the population, the top 1%. But then we see a divergence beginning roughly in the 1980s, and we see that the case of, for example, Sweden, however, remains essentially unchanged. The same thing with Japan, as well as France. They don't change all that much. But if you look at the United Kingdom, we see that share of the 1% increasing, pretty significantly. But also the United States, we see this as a real outlier that beginning in the 1980s, accelerating in the 1990s and going all the way up to around 2005, a little bit past 2005, where the share of national income that is owned by the top 1% is back to where it was essentially in the early part of the 20th century. And so there's been globally, but especially in the United States, public demands about the state playing a larger role in redistributing wealth away from people that have much more of it to the poor population. And you'll see this displayed in the video, the YouTube video that you're going to be watching for this. So I would recommend you watch the video after this section, or this video, this part of the video lecture. There's another graph that I wanted to share with you. Again, it's very similar. It has some different countries, some overlap with the ones before. It goes a little bit further than the last graph. And again, it shows something very similar. It doesn't go back as far, but you can see that in the 1990s, this one has a little bit more nuance to it. France is hovering around the same over that time period. We see that the United Kingdom, as was demonstrated before, income inequality grows in this period. Canada also shows a significant change in the distribution of wealth in the country. And then, of course, the United States also is a bit of an outlier, where that income inequality is growing dramatically. One stark example of this in the case of the United States is the Walton family. The Walton family of Sam Walton is the family that owns Walmart. And this is just one example of income inequality in the United States. So you'll see here that all the Walton heirs have a combined wealth of $145 billion. In other words, all these heirs, their wealth is equal to the combined wealth of over 40% of the bottom 42% of American families. So a single family, the single Walton family, has more wealth, has more income than the bottom 42% of American families. Just to put this in perspective, as you can see on the screen, $145 billion would be enough to purchase every single sports franchise in the NBA, NFL, Major League Baseball, MLH, all of them. The Walton family would be able to purchase them and still have money left over. And so this is one of the concerns or criticisms that many people in society feel, that, when you have so many people that don't have any wealth, that are eking by, and you have the Walton family with this kind of wealth, it makes it problematic for people. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later on this week when we have our Google Meet conversation.